Om Asato Ma Sadgamaya Tamaso Ma Jyotirgamaya Mrityorma Amritam Gamaya Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Good evening. Welcome to our last session on the four yogas, right? We've already covered Karma Yoga, Bhakti Yoga, Jnana Yoga, and the last one, and now the last of the four, Raja Yoga. So that's going to be the focus of today's interactive discussion. Feel free to ask any questions when you have them, make comments. This, in a way, might be the trickiest to talk about for different reasons. First of all, because the term Raja Yoga has somewhat different meanings in different contexts. One of the books that I'll be relying on is Swami Vivekananda's Raja Yoga. Okay, he has books on all four of the yogas, and this is his book on Raja Yoga. And tellingly, he's got a bunch of chapters on Raja Yoga, and then he's got the second half of the book is Patanjali's yoga aphorisms. So the foundational scripture for Raja Yoga is Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. And the book I'd recommend, by the way, if you're curious about delving into these things more deeply, is Edwin Bryant's The Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. It's a nice book for a lot of reasons. Not that I agree with everything he says, but it's well done. He is a Vaishnava spiritual practitioner and a professor of Indic studies at Rutgers University. So he's both a scholar and a spiritual aspirant, which I think is a value-added thing. I mean, he has kind of both sides. And so it reads like a scholarly book while still being accessible and very sadhana oriented, spiritual practice, oriented towards spiritual practice. So I'm teaching a class on Yoga Sutras of Patanjali now in Hollywood and in our ashrama. And I'm using this as our main textbook, but I'm also drawing on other commentaries. And another nice thing about this book is he refers not only to traditional commentators. So the first traditional one is called Vyasa. And then there are a bunch of others, Vachaspati Mishra and Vijnana Bhikshu and others. And he kind of refers to those, and a more modern one called Hariharanandananya. But he also draws on modern scholarship. And he talks about modern scholarly views on interpretations of different concepts in the Yoga Sutras. And so I think it really is a unique, helpful approach, bringing the East and the West together, bringing ancient and modern together. And as I said, and the way I teach it is I teach it critically, right? So it's not to take everything he says as gospel truth, but as great talking points and just, and I'll just mention one thing that I'll talk about it in more detail later. There's, how many of you have read parts of the Yoga Sutras at least? But then not really, nobody, huh? Okay, hey. There's a common assumption that Patanjali's yoga philosophy is either atheistic or non-theistic. So atheistic means you believe that there is no God. And by non-theistic means maybe like something like, even if God exists, he's irrelevant, right? That's like one of the mainstream understandings of yoga philosophy. But one thing that I find interesting about this book is because this guy's a Vaishnava. So he's a hardcore bhakta. Not ISKCON, but he belongs to this other, like similar tradition. He defends this kind of theistic interpretation of the Yoga Sutras because there are a few sutras which talk about God. Okay, there is a God, but the question is what exactly, how do you define God? And how important is God and the worship of God in the system of Patanjali? And he's at one extreme because he's really pushing for like a lot of bhakti in this. And at the other extreme, you get these scholars like Gerald James Larson. He was a famous professor of Sankhya Yoga at UCSB, who passed away a few years ago. And he argues for an almost atheistic kind of interpretation of the Yoga Sutras. And I just wanted to flag, because we're at a university and I'm also a scholar, like it's important not to like be dogmatic about these things, but to just keep open different possibilities. So just be aware that there's a whole spectrum of views on whether Patanjali's philosophy accepts God, and even if it accepts God, what exactly is that God and how important is God to the system and in spiritual practice? Okay. So anyway, but now coming back to the beginning and to the basics. The last class was on the path of knowledge, right? So that primarily involves intellectual reasoning about our true nature as non-dual pure consciousness. This is Shankara's school. Bhakti yoga involves devotional practices aimed toward or directed toward a personal God. And then, of course, there are many forms that the personal God can take depending on your Ishta Devata, right? This concept of what is Ishta Devata? No one knows? Ishta Devata. What is Ishta Devata?
Favorite God.
Yeah, right, exactly. Your preferred form of God. Sometimes they refer to it as chosen deity. And I like to say that it's not so much us choosing God, but God choosing us. But preferred form is good. Yeah. What's the form of God that you feel naturally drawn toward that attracts you? So Ishta Devata. That's Bhakti Yoga. And what was there? Oh, Karma Yoga, the path of selfless action, right? Which is very practical for students. We talked about that at length. So whatever you do, including your studies, your medical school, this and that, you do it as an offering to the divine. This one, what is the focus of this Raja Yoga, this fourth yoga? Meditation. Which does not mean that meditation is absent from the other yogas. You'll find it especially prominent in Bhakti Yoga, for instance, because meditation is a major practice in Bhakti Yoga, except you're told what's the object of meditation in Bhakti Yoga. It's kind of obvious. Think about it. What should you be meditating on in Bhakti Yoga? Exactly. Why are you so afraid? Come on. Yeah. Like, yes, God. Exactly. In the path of knowledge, there's some internal controversy depending on what kind of Advaita and what stripe of Advaita you are in terms of how important meditation is. But still, it does have a role in Advaita Vedanta. But then the question is, well, what do you meditate on? What they usually say is you should meditate on Nirguna Brahman, on non-dual pure consciousness, basically. Like, and they might have these little things like you can visualize an effulgent light which represents non-dual Brahman or something like that. So that's kind of more non-dual meditation, but that's still a kind of meditation, right? Okay, so now it's not that meditation is absent from these other yogas, but in Raja Yoga, meditation is a central practice, okay? And the object of meditation is a bit different from what it is in these other traditions. Okay, so that's the first thing, is that Raja Yoga, at the heart of Raja Yoga is the practice of meditation. It's based on Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. The sutra genre, sutra literally means thread. I think we talked about this, right, in the context of Brahma Sutra, maybe long back, but sutra means thread. There are these little aphoristic kind of statements in Sanskrit outlining the essence of the yoga philosophy and also the practices of yoga. And fortunately, these yoga sutras are much more readable and kind of grammatically coherent and complete than something like the Brahma Sutras. Have any of you ever attempted to crack open the Brahma Sutras? It's quite daunting, and the sutras are so compressed that they're missing essential, even grammatical information. Like literally, some of the sutras are just cha. Cha means and. So that's a sutra. So then what happens is the interpreters, the commentators have a field day with they can really push those sutras in the direction of their own philosophical views. Because the sutras themselves are kind of underdetermined, right? Whereas these sutras are actually more complete. So there's still room for interpretation, but less room than other kinds of sutra texts. Okay, so that's one thing to keep in mind. And the Yoga Sutra consists of 4 books. Okay, and I'm not going to go into details unless you're interested of the structure of the text. But anyway, it has 4 books, a number of sutras in each of the books. But let me just try to summarize the main philosophical framework of yoga and then the spiritual practices based on that philosophy and how they could be helpful to us as spiritual aspirants. So first of all, it's called yoga philosophy. I keep using the term yoga. What does yoga mean? According to Patanjali, he defines it in the 2nd sutra of book 1. Does anyone know? 1.2. Yoga chitta vritti nirodha. So I'll write that down. Yoga is, this is, okay, not gonna. Chitta, vritti, nirodha. Okay, chitta means mind. Vritti means like waves or fluctuations and even thoughts. And nirodha means restraint or cessation or stoppage. So yoga is defined as the stoppage of all mental states, mental fluctuations. So the mind should be complete blank, basically. That's the aim of yoga, actually. And this is yoga defined in this within the yoga philosophy, within Patanjali's yoga philosophy, because the term yoga has other meanings. What's the more standard meaning of yoga? Yeah, exactly. Yoking. The word, linguistically speaking, what linguists posit is that there was this Proto-Indo-European language from which came Latin, Greek, and Sanskrit, which explains why there's similarity in words across these three classical languages. And so the word yoke in English goes back to a Latin term, which is linked to yoga, and yukta, which means being yoked or yoking in Sanskrit as well. So because probably in this Proto-Indo-European language, there was this word like that, yoga, yukta, something along those lines. Okay, so that's the standard meaning of yoga, and that's what it means when we talk about the four yogas. What is the purpose of all four yogas? To reunite us with the divine, right? The problem is in yoga philosophy, because the metaphysics is different, yoga has to be defined differently. Okay. And so yoga is defined instead as making your mind a complete blank, removing all fluctuations from the mind. Okay. Why is it important to do that? Well, we need to understand, we have to go more deeply into the philosophy. Okay. Now, the philosophy of Patanjali, so yoga philosophy is based on an even more ancient philosophy called Sankhya. Have any of you heard of it? Sankhya, Samkhya. So Sankhya. Okay. I think I talked about this long back, but there are six schools of Indian philosophy that are based on, that accept the authority of the Vedas. Okay. Any guesses that want to take a stab at any of the six? What are the six schools? Any of them? No? One of them is Sankhya. Okay. So one is Sankhya, and they're all kind of paired. Sankhya, yoga. See, these two are kind of paired. Three, Nyaya. This is a school of logic. Four, Vaisheshika. These are also paired. They kind of go together. They're like sister philosophies. And then you get Purva Mimamsa. This is a school that emphasizes Vedic ritualism. So back in the Rig Veda, where it says like sacrifice a horse, it's called it's called the Ashwamedha sacrifice. You sacrifice this giant horse into a fire, and then there's this whole philosophy of ritualism, which is like you do that, you accrue some dharma, and then what happens? You go to some nice heaven and you enjoy there, but you have to come back. And then you do more rituals, and then you go back to heaven. And then so it's this kind of, so there's a famous statement in the Rig Veda, Svarga kamo yajeta. One should sacrifice, perform sacrifices if one wants to go to heaven. Okay, so that's Purvimamsa. And then sixth, this is the one that's most important for us. It's called Vedanta or Uttara Mimamsa. They're synonyms. Because Purva means like earlier, and Uttara means later or more advanced. It's kind of like this Theravada and not Theravada, Hinayana and this is dangerous. Okay, so Hinayana and Mahayana in Buddhism, it's a little pejorative, right? To say Hinayana, it means the lesser vehicle. So it's the Mahayanas, of course, who use the term to refer to the previous, or like the Christians calling the Hebrew Bible the Old Testament, right? It's like our Bible has, the New Testament has superseded it. It's superior in some way. So that's kind of what the Vedantins do with respect to school number 5. They're like, you guys are fine, but we're like 2.0. Okay. So anyway, those are the 6 schools. So that's to give you a broader sense of where Sankhya fits within. We've talked about Vedanta a lot already. We've got Vedanta here, sitting here. Okay. So now Sankhya is one of these, it's the most ancient of all the schools of Indian philosophy. It predates Buddhism. I don't know about Jainism because Jainism is also very ancient. But it may very well also predate Jainism. And they're similar, actually, Sankhya and Jainism in some ways. Now, what is the Sankhya philosophy? I'm not going to go into details here, but one of their key doctrines is what's called metaphysical dualism. There are only 2 fundamental entities. There's Purusha on one side, and there's Prakriti on the other. Purusha is the eternal, conscious, and immaterial soul or self. Okay? And then Prakriti is insentient nature. Everything in nature. This board I'm writing on, our physical bodies, even our minds. In Indian philosophy, our minds are also mind. So body, mind, all fall on the side of Prakriti, actually. Okay. And what Sankhya says is we suffer because we don't know who we truly are. We mistakenly identify with this physical body and with the mind. And because the body is subject to disease and death, because the mind constantly fluctuates, and because of these 3 gunas, which are constantly jostling with each other. And so the mind is sometimes happy, sometimes sad, sometimes this, something like that, agitated. It's a recipe for suffering if we identify with the body and the mind, right? So what Sankhya says is, in truth, we are not the body. We are also not even the mind. We are Purusha. We are eternal, immaterial, conscious souls, completely separate from anything in nature. And so completely unaffected by anything that happens. There could be the biggest earthquake or tsunami in the world. Your body can be torn to pieces, but the Purusha, completely unaffected and eternally liberated and not subject to, beyond the possibility of any kind of suffering or affliction. Okay? Okay. Now, Sankhya, if you ask Sankhya philosophers, well, so how do I overcome the suffering? How do I realize my true nature? Their general answer is through vichara. It's kind of like the path of knowledge in Advaita. It's kind of like, actually, Advaita is strongly influenced by Sankhya, right? It precedes Advaita Vedanta. And so the idea is through vichara, through viveka, discrimination, discriminate between self and not self, between the body-mind complex on the one hand and the Purusha on the other, and then you will realize your true nature as a Purusha. Of course, there are all sorts of other prerequisites, like a very high level of purity and renunciation and these kinds of things, and ethical living and all that. But if you have all that in place, your mind becomes very pure and capable of this kind of discrimination, and you can just separate Purusha from Prakriti and then realize that you're actually, oh, wait, for so many lifetimes, I thought that I was the body mind, but in fact, I'm not. I'm the eternal soul, completely separate from, and then that's liberation. Now, how do we get to Patanjali's yoga? Well, Patanjali's yoga philosophy develops on the basis of this Sankhyan metaphysical dualism. It accepts the Sankhyan metaphysical system fully, except there are some differences, some of them being subtle. One of them, though, is that in Sankhya, there's no place for Ishvara. What does the term Ishvara mean? Yeah. So Ishvara has no role. In Sankhya, okay. But in yoga, there are a number of sutras dedicated to explaining who is Ishvara, how is Ishvara relevant to our spiritual practice, and so on. So there's a kind of a devotional element, or apparently devotional element, which is missing from Sankhya. So that's a kind of one addition that you get in the yoga philosophy, is God. But then secondly, the spiritual practices recommended by Patanjali in the Yoga Sutras are somewhat different from the practices mentioned in Sankhya. As I said, Sankhya's main practices is vichara, discrimination, reasoning, distinguishing Purusha from Prakriti. That's an important part of Patanjali as well, but they have this whole scheme of spiritual practices which you don't find in Sankhya philosophy. It's called Ashtanga Yoga. Ashtanga. This is the 8-limbed yoga. Okay? Have any of you heard of this? No? You have. Some of it. Okay, so we have, what are these 8 limbs? Yama, Niyama, I'll explain them. This will take a while because asana, pranayama, pratyahara, dharana, dhyana, samadhi. Okay, yama. What are yamas? These are, you can call them, define, translate in different ways, but it would be like restraints or don'ts. Like, don't do this, don't do that, or avoid doing this or that. Okay, so I just say don'ts. The niyamas are do's. What are the don'ts? There are 5 main practices that fall under yama. I don't know if I have enough room here for them, but one is a doctrine that Gandhi strongly emphasized, which is ahimsa, non-injury, right, toward other creatures. And okay, so non-injury. Oh my goodness. Second one, satyam, truthfulness. So these are all kind of ethical observances, okay? Truthfulness is interesting. Obviously, it means don't tell lies, so refrain from lying. I think that though, there's a subtle dimension of this. Oh, I didn't realize that that's funny. Okay, so there's a marker on both sides. Yeah. Okay, so that's what was I saying? Oh yeah, truthfulness. So just the other day, I was supposed to meet a devotee in the ashrama at like 10 o'clock. And the devotee is Indian, and so he's operating on Indian Standard Time. And so he came a few minutes late. And then I gave him a little lecture and I said, listen, if you say you're going to come at a certain time, number one, it's a matter of observing truthfulness, because you said, I'll be there at a certain time. Unless you say, well, I'll try to get there. If you say try, or you say, I'll get there around, that's okay. But if you really say, I'll get there, I'll see you at 10, then, and you don't come at 10, then you're not observing truthfulness, strictly speaking. So I'd say there are like subtle ways in which truthfulness, like even if you're meeting it in a gross way, if you're observing it at a grosser level, like you're not telling blatant lies to people, there are more subtle ways that you have to be careful about. Like there's an incident in Ramakrishna's life where he had promised a devotee that he would come to his house in Kolkata. Ramakrishna lived in Dakshineshwar, which is quite far actually, especially at that time before cars and all. This is 1870s, 80s. And then it was like dark, and then he realized it was like already 10 or 11. He suddenly realized, oh man, I told him I'd visit him today. It's like almost midnight. But because he said, he said I have to keep my word. And so he drove all the way to Kolkata. There were no phones or anything at the time where he could just say like, hey, sorry. So it took him over an hour to get there. And then he knew he was asleep, but he just knocked on his door, not expecting him to answer the door, but just said, hey, I come for you because I told you I would come today. And then he went back just because he wouldn't be able to sleep at night because that was the level of his observing of truthfulness. That's just one example, but I think we can all try to be a little bit, this is not an indirect way of telling you to come on time, but I do think that we should think about the subtle manifestations of these things that I think we should be careful about. So truthfulness. Then there's asteya, which means refraining from stealing. Okay, don't steal. It's kind of most of us, I don't think that's a big problem. Okay. Mm-hmm. Oh, okay, thanks. It's enough battery for,
Yeah, I mean,
hopefully. Okay.
replug it.
All right. Okay, good. Next one. This is, I'm going to leave it in the Sanskrit because it's an important word and it's not easy to translate actually. So we'll talk about it. Brahmacharya. What does brahmacharya mean? Does anyone know? Yeah, that's a standard or translation. Celibacy. That covers part of it. I mean, celibacy means you're refraining from sexual activities, right? But I would say that the deeper and more comprehensive definition would be something like purity in thought, word, and deed. So like, yeah, like if you just say celibacy, you could be an incel right now. Like everyone knows what an incel is, right? And I'd be thinking all the time, like being really angry about the fact that you're celibate and like this and that. So that's not brahmacharya. Brahmacharya is sexual purity in thought, word, and deed. The deed is at the grossest level, and then also it gets like increasingly subtle. You have to practice it at multiple levels, and you start from the gross and you work up to the subtle. And in word as well, and then in thought, which is very hard, right? That's the hardest to control, is that you can prevent yourself from doing things at a physical level, and then still it pops up in the mind, right? And so it's very difficult, and it's like it takes lifetimes of practice. And then there are also in Hindu scriptures, there's like brahmacharya practiced in different ways depending on what stage of life you're at. So monks are expected to practice it in the extreme form to the best of their ability. Householders are also expected to practice brahmacharya in a different way. They can have children, and so like Ramakrishna would say to householders, he would say, after having one or two children, try to live with your spouse like brother and sister. That kind of idea. The idea is it's a more gradual process. You acknowledge total purity as a kind of ideal, but one that you have to work toward together and figure it out. Okay. And then the fifth one is, and of course, this is not unique to yoga philosophy. We find the emphasis on brahmacharya also in Vedanta and the other schools. And we'll get to that in a second about why. Why is that important? Aparigraha, refraining from, this is the fifth. There are five, right? So 1, 2, 3, 4. There's not enough space here. So 5 is refraining. What's the definition here? Refraining from Coveting or from greed. Okay, desiring things in excess of what you need. Okay. Okay, now, what is the idea behind all these things? All these things that we're being told not to do are all things that reinforce our identification with the body-mind complex. Because in some way, all the things that we're being told not to do gratify either the physical body or the mind or both. If you just think about it, like, non-injury. Well, that means, so when you injure somebody, it's because you're angry. Where's the anger? It's from the mind. And then you can literally physically injure something, it means you're using the body. If you're using your body to hit somebody, you're reinforcing your body consciousness. You're also thinking of other people as bodies, right? Truthfulness. Well, when you lie, you're doing it because you're trying to get some advantage from lying, right? Could be irrational, just lying because you're crazy, but often you lie because there's something in it for you, right? There's some selfish motivation in it for you, but who's the you there? Who's the one who benefits? Either the body or the mind or both, right? Could be like somebody's having an affair, and then the spouse asks, "Oh, where were you yesterday?" And then the person who's having the affair will make up they were with the person that you're having an affair with, but they're gonna lie and tell their partner, "Oh, I was with some friends at a cafe." Why? Because they don't want to be caught, right? But it's the body mind that's enjoying with the person they're having the affair with. Okay. And so you can run through all of these the same way. So brahmacharya, this is the way to understand why brahmacharya is important. It's for the same reason. It's because sexual thoughts, sexual acts, the idea is that reinforces your identification with the body-mind complex, right? Because that's what's gratified. And Hinduism it's a generous religion, and it recognizes that spiritual life is a journey of many lifetimes. And so they have traditionally they have this idea of 4 stages in life: the student phase, the householder stage, forest dwelling stage, and then the sannyasa stage, the monastic stage. And it may never have been the case that people went through all 4 stages, but there might have been a time in the past. But the idea is just to think about life in this way, as you begin as supposed to be a celibate student. I don't know how many people observe that. And then householder, where you marry, you have children, you fulfill your legitimate desires or whatever. Third is, at some point, this is kind of along the lines of what Ramakrishna tells householders, which is that at some point, your marriage needs to evolve away from the physical dimension. And then it's called the Vanaprastha stage. So you talk to your spouse, you're like 60 or something, or I don't know what the age thing is, but the idea is, all right, so let's do this. Let's both be full-time spiritual aspirants. And there are different ways you could do that. One is you live in a hut together, but in different beds, and you practice austerities and you engage primarily in spiritual practices. The other way is, let's separate now on good terms, not like a divorce, maybe amicable separation or something. And then you live in different huts and you do your spiritual practices independently. That's forest dwelling, but it's a kind of preparation for full-blown monasticism, where you take a vow to renounce worldly attachments and pleasures and all that. And there's a kind of sequence there. The idea is that in Indian culture, at least, that's part of the reason why after I got my PhD, I moved to India, because I want to be a monk. And it's a country that upholds renunciation as an ideal and has a reverence for monastic traditions. So it's a great place to be if you're interested in being a monk. So the doctrine of 4 stages of life is connected with another traditional doctrine, which are the 4 values in life, or the 4 aims in life. Does anyone know what they are in Hinduism? I'll tell you the first one, then let's see if you can get any of the other ones. Dharma. Then there are 3 more. Moksha is the last one. So now we've got 1 and 4. Okay, we've got 1 is dharma. Yeah, what did you say? Very good. Artha, kama. Dharma means ethical living. 2, artha. material possessions, wealth. Kama, fulfillment of desires, worldly desires. There's a place for that too. That's why we have a treatise called Kama Sutra. And then moksha, liberation, right? Okay, now, all of these values are legitimate values, except that there's a reason why this comes last, moksha. Because for every true Hindu, the ultimate goal of life is liberation from this cycle of rebirth. That doesn't mean that these things are irrelevant. It means that these other values, these other aims should always be subordinated to the highest goal of life, which is liberation. No matter what else you do, your fundamental orientation should be a spiritual one. That's the idea. Okay. Why did I go off on all this? Oh, so that's why brahmacharya itself it'll manifest in different ways depending on what stage of life you're in. So for a householder, it means sexual restraint in a certain way. So like not no holds barred. And then also this Western idea of like, I'm 89 years old and now I'm gonna go into Viagra and try to prolong my sex life as long as possible. So that's not the Hindu way of thinking about these things. After a certain time, you should try to outgrow the carnal dimension and then spiritualize the relationship. Okay. And then niyama. It's getting confusing because there's not enough room on the board. But these are the do's, right? The things you should do. What are the things that you should do? 5 main things. Maybe I'll use red to make it a little bit. There we go. Now I'm using the other side. Okay. So 1 is purity and cleanliness, actually. The word is shaucha. And so it's both external cleanliness, and so, shower regularly and that kind of stuff. Don't be gross. And internal cleanliness also. That's the more difficult and more important practice. Where the mind should be pure. Santosha, which means contentment. This is very important. There's a scripture called Vairagya Shatakam, which means 100 verses on detachment. And there's a great verse which explains true wealth and true poverty. Satu bhavati daridro yasya trishna vishala. So that person is poor whose desires are great. And then manasi cha paritushte kortavan ko daridraha. When the mind is contented, so the word contentment, paritushte, manasi cha paritushte kortavan ko daridraha. Who is the rich person? Who is the poor person? So true wealth is being content with what you already have. So you can be the richest person in the world. You can be Elon Musk. But if you desire to make much larger SpaceX rockets, which will require $10 billion more, and you don't have that yet, you have an unfulfilled desire, which is making you unhappy. Whereas the person who makes $50,000 a year, but is content with their, whatever, their Kia. We have some Kia cars in our ashram. That's like, they're not that expensive. So anyway, with their Kia, right? They don't care. They don't need a Rolls Royce. They don't need a Porsche, Lamborghini. That person is richer in this deeper spiritual sense. Because it's the ultimate wealth to be content, right? So that's santosha. So there's shaucha, santosha, tapaha, tapas. I'm going to leave this untranslated as well. But the standard translation of tapas, anyone? Tapas. T-A-P. It's not the Mexican food. I have the Sanskrit here.
Yeah,
Sort of. Okay, but there's a word beginning with A, which is the standard translation of tapas. Austerity. Yeah, austerity. Exactly. What do we normally think of when we hear the word austerity? Like in India, often you hear things like there's like a monk who like stands on one leg for 20 years. Like, or not sleeping, right? Like preventing himself from sleeping. They'll do these, like, come up with these devices So that even if he dozes off, he'll be jerked up again so that he can't sleep and like stuff like that. So lots of things. Living in the extremely cold parts of the Himalayas, wearing nothing. And like, okay. So those are called bodily austerities, right? A lot of those kinds of things. But those are austerities, but Bhagavad Gita teaches a higher kind of austerity, which is more spiritual and which is more practical and more important for us to practice. And it distinguishes three kinds of tapas, austerity. Austerity of the physical body, austerity of speech, and austerity of mind. Okay. And so austerity of the body is defined as Deva Dvija Guru Prajna Pujanam Shauchamajavam. So there's some overlap with Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, and it's possible that Patanjali's Yoga Sutra was kind of influenced to some extent by Gita. Dating of these texts is kind of difficult, just because we don't have a clear historical record on these things. But so the first thing is Deva Dvija Guru Prajna Pujanam. You should literally worship and bow down to Deva, to God, to your Guru, Deva Dvija Guru Prajna, those who are respected elders, and those who are your teachers, basically. Like show reverence to them. And why is that a bodily austerity? Because it often involves literally bending the knee. That's the idea behind pranams in Indian culture. I'm sure many of you, I don't know how many of you went to India when you're young to visit your relatives, right? But I used to. And my parents would say, now you have to touch the feet of your grandmother, your grandfather, this and that. That kind of idea. Because literally making your body bend down like that is a way of becoming humble. The word namaste means literally bowing down, bending down. Namas. So it's also kind of bending down on the ego in a certain way. There are like new studies out by, have you heard of Amy Cuddy? Cuddy at Harvard. She's done interesting work on what she calls power poses. And where she has this one where she calls the Wonder Woman pose, like this, because Wonder Woman would stand like this. And she did these experiments where she I think hooked up the brains of these people to brain scanners, and she's checking their brain activity and their like hormonal levels and stuff like that. And she just told them, these, especially women, she's focused primarily on the problem that she was addressing is that women tend to be in far fewer leadership positions in the major companies and stuff like that. And part of the reason is a certain kind of like fear among women to, participate in places in activities that involve primarily men, or because men are more assertive and women. So she was kind of trying to explore why, and then also try to change that in some way. And so she found that part of the problem is that a lot of women were kind of timid, even physically, kind of hunched over and kind of like they didn't have that. And so the experiment was, she told these women for 5 minutes, just stand in Wonder Woman pose. And she found that I think it's the cortisol levels, like things that male leaders, like CEOs, show in abundance, things that you need to exude confidence, leadership qualities, just by standing in a certain way, literally by changing their physical posture, by smiling. That's another funny thing that happened. I discovered this for the first time in India. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this, but I first moved out in 2009, and I joined at this university run by our monastic order called Vivekananda University. And I'd wake up very early for meditation because there's 4 o'clock meditation at Brahma Muhurta. Brahma Muhurta means at the time when, just at the sunrise, or before sunrise. But I come back from meditation, do my exercise, and it's around 6 o'clock. Every day on cue at 6, I start hearing from behind the university a group of people laughing hysterically. And the first day I'm like, oh, okay, that's, whatever, it's India and lots of things are happening. That's fine. Every day at the same time, a bunch of people laughing uncontrollably and hysterically. And then I find out later they have a laughing club. Have you heard of a laughing club? You know about them, huh? Does anyone know? It's really funny. This is so these people will just get together and they laugh together on cue. And without even like, it's one thing to like watch Seinfeld together and then like, but no, it's just like you just decide to laugh together. And the interesting thing is, you watch it, there's like funny YouTube videos about it where they interview people who are in these laughing clubs. And they say things like, look, like I had a blood pressure problem and my blood pressure has gone down. My mood has improved. I suffered from depression, but now I feel a lot happier and I have a more positive attitude toward life. What does that mean? Even if it's forced in a certain, like you call that, but like it's because there's nothing actually prompting it other than just, you saying, but just by physically making yourself smile and laugh can actually put you in a better state of mind. So anyway, all of this goes back to this idea of bodily austerity, literally bending the knee and bowing down to your elders, to your guru, to God. Why do you do pranams when you enter a temple? It makes you humble, And you can tell, like, they're like really arrogant people. There are certain gestures, like there's a way they walk, there's a way they talk, there's a way they carry themselves. You know what I mean? And there's a way that very timid and shy people behave. So it was funny when I first moved to India. I'm ethnically 100% Bengali Indian, 100% Indian. But a lot of these other monks that I was with, they're like, you must be like half American. One of your parents must be white. I was like, no, why do you think that? And I said, no, you walk differently. It's funny. Like there's a difference in these, like even the gait and different things. Forget about accent. That's a separate thing. But I'm talking about even like just like physical posture and stuff is very different. NRI Indians who have lived a long time outside of India, their physical posture starts to change. So anyway, so that's bodily austerity. That's part of bodily austerity. Okay. And then brahmacharyam is in there as well in the Gita. So that kind of overlaps with the yamas. Okay. But then there are two other kinds of austerity in the Gita. And notice that bodily austerity has nothing to do with standing on one leg and torturing yourself and none of that. But these are the more important things that are very practicable for all of us, Okay. And then secondly, vangmayam tapa. Vangmayam means austerity of speech, what you say or don't say. And this is really tricky, threading this needle. Anudvegakaram vakyam satyam priyatam chet swadhyayabhasanam chaiva vangmayam tabuchyate. So I'll explain it. Okay, what should you say? You should say things, your speech should be, number one, anudvegakaram. It shouldn't disturb others. Okay? Anudvegakaram vakyam. Satyam, it should be truthful at the same time. So you can't just tell pleasant lies to people to make people feel good. And priyahitam, it should be beneficial to the listener, to the hearer, the person you're talking to. And you see why that can be tricky sometimes. Because sometimes, isn't it important to tell the harsh truth sometimes? Maybe, arguably, there are some contexts in which the truth hurts. It may not be pleasant to the person hearing it, but it's tricky though, right? Because there's some people who I err on this side too, which is a problem I have, but of kind of like saying like, look, like I'm honest and I have to be honest, even if it's not a very pleasant truth or something, and so be it. So, but if somebody is like, there are many examples of like, you can like, if somebody's doing something really bad, right? It depends on what your position is vis-a-vis that person. Like if you're the parent of a child who's doing something bad, I think it's probably the duty of a parent to tell the harsh truth to the child. But there's also a way of saying it, right? You could be screaming at the child, beating the child. That's not the right way to do it, right? Verbally abusing the child, not a good idea. So can you be truthful, but also respectful and loving at the same time, such that what you say is still beneficial to your child? And it could be hurtful in a certain way. Maybe the kid will feel offended or will cry, but in the long run, the kid will be benefited. So I think there are things these things, it's not that simple, I think. But this is the ideal that we should aim at when we speak. We should speak in such a way that we never tell a lie. We should always tell the truth. But we should also make sure that what we say is beneficial to the person we're talking to and not hurtful or disturbing. Okay. And then there's the hardest of all austerities, mental austerity of the mind. Manav prasada samyatvam maunamatvi nigraha. So self-control, restraining the self. This is mental austerity in controlling the mind, controlling the thoughts. It's very, very difficult. So that's a kind of That's a kind of austerity. These are the higher forms of austerity that all of us, in order to achieve anything great, we have to do some level of mental austerity, if you think about it. So Olympic level athletes, scientists, doctors, they have to be able to control the mind. And in spiritual life, that becomes absolutely essential. And it has to be done in a more systematic way. That's the idea. Okay. And another form of mental austerity is purity of mind. Okay. Now, that's the third of the 3 niyamas, and then there are 2 more. There's swadhyaya, and then swadhyaya means scriptural study. That's kind of easy. It's helpful actually to, especially in the midst of all of your, especially in a place like college where you're surrounded by people of various persuasions and whatever. But it's good to just like, even if it's for 5 minutes or something, if you just read some spiritual text of some sort. It doesn't even have to be a Hindu scripture. It doesn't matter. It could be anything, but something spiritually uplifting. I every day I read just a few minutes of the gospel at the end of the day in Bengali, Kotamrita it's called, the teachings of Ramakrishna, right before going to bed, because it kind of like tunes the mind to a spiritual level right at the end of a long day. I also do something in the morning, every morning after breakfast. I would do it before breakfast because of the schedule, it's not possible. But I recite verses from the Gita, some sannyasa mantras, which is the sannyasa vows I took, the monastic vows I took in Sanskrit. And then, yeah, some other like Sanskrit, kind of little scriptural kind of verses, just to kind of elevate the mind, try to keep the mind on a higher plane. So that's Svadhyaya, but it's helpful for everybody. I'd recommend that for everybody. And then the 5th one is Ishvara Pranidhana. And this is basically devotion to God. Devotion to Ishvara. Okay, so this is the bhakti element. See, so bhakti, you find it in the 5th element in the 2nd of the 8 limbs of the Ashtanga Yoga. Okay. And I won't go into more detail about what exactly is God, but arguably there is room for bhakti in yoga philosophy. And now I will more briefly talk about the remaining 5 limbs, 6 limbs. Third, asana. Asana. These days, asana means these like yoga asanas in the sense of like the different things you can do. They have Sanskrit names, but like they have like downward dog and this and that. A lot of different things. And that's all great. I do yoga myself in the morning, Surya Namaskars and other things. That's good for keeping the body healthy. But what Patanjali means by asana is sthira sukham asanam. Sthira sukham asanam. Sthira means still. Sukham means comfortable. So any posture which is comfortable and which keeps you straight and still, spine straight for a long period of time so that you can meditate is a good asana. And so that depends on you. Like one person might be able to do the lotus pose, other people half lotus, Ardha Padmasana, other people normal cross leg, another one can't sit on the floor, they do it on a chair, whatever it is, but that's all that it means. And now, well, what is the role of all these other asanas that were taught in yoga classes and all that? They can be helps to make the body limber and to help you to remain in a meditative posture for a long period of time. That's the idea. Because the ultimate aim of Raja Yoga is to sit in meditation for a long period of time. Concentrate on your true nature as Purusha. Right? Until you finally attain these very high states of what are called samadhi, when the mind is completely stilled and you realize your true nature as Purusha, separate from the body-mind complex. The way to do that is through meditation. You can only meditate properly if you're able to sit still for long periods of time. So if downward dog helps you with that, do downward dog to your heart's content. That's the idea. Okay, so that's Patanjali's approach. 4th, pranayama, control of breath. Have any of you attempted to practice pranayama at all? Yeah, a little bit. Where you do this, right? You hold one nostril with your thumb. and they're ratios. Okay, so it's usually a 1-4-2 ratio. There are different ways, but 1-4-2 is a standard one. So if you do 4 counts on the inhalation, that means 16 counts on the retention of breath, called kumbhaka, where you block both nostrils and you're not breathing through your mouth, obviously, so it's retention. And then it's 8 counts on the exhalation, and you do the other nostril, right? So it's, and then, so that's pranayama. I've noticed in the West, especially, it's kind of popular. And I think part of the reason is because when people do it, the results are kind of tangible in a certain way. It's very concrete. They feel a kind of euphoria. It has dangers, though. I mean, what Swami Vivekananda says here, he's very explicit about it. He says, if you're not strictly practicing brahmacharya, if observing celibacy and purity, it's very, very dangerous to be practicing a lot of pranayama, because he says it can actually make you go crazy. And there have been cases of this. You can do a little bit for a few minutes. That's not harmful as far as I'm aware. And what Ramakrishna says is, if you practice devotion, if you have enough devotion for God, you will automatically attain a state of kumbhaka, where the breath will be suspended without even having to try. You don't have to do all these other practices, pranayama and this and that. It'll just happen spontaneously. And so this is not mandatory in the bhakti path, pranayama, for instance. But it's a help in yoga philosophy. And then the 5th one is pratyahara. This means withdrawal of the senses. From sense objects. So again, this is common across spiritual traditions in India. There's a beautiful metaphor used in the Gita to explain the same thing, involving a tortoise. Does anyone know? It's a turtle. Chapter 2. Yada samharate chayam purmongani vasarvasha indriyan indriyarthebhyas tasya prajna pratishita. The wise one is a person who, like a tortoise. What does a tortoise do? When there's a predator that wants to eat it or something, what will the tortoise do? It'll withdraw its limbs immediately. It'll retract its limbs into its shell, and it won't draw back those limbs until it's out of danger, right? Likewise, the realized soul and the wise person is the one who will immediately withdraw his or her sense organs from sense objects. Okay. So that's just a good metaphor to capture pratyahara. And then you get these last 3, dharana, dhyana, and samadhi. All of these are kinds of different stages in intensity of concentration. So all of them involve meditation. So you're in this meditative pose, you're sitting there for a long time, you're trying to meditate on your true nature as Purusha. But what happens? The mind wanders. That's natural. Anybody who's tried to meditate will know that. If any of you try to think of God for 30 seconds, your mind's going to wander to something else. It's very hard because the mind's not pure and there are all sorts of desires in it. So these last 3 stages, dharana, dhyana, samadhi, dharana can just be translated as concentration, basically. But the idea is, as your concentration deepens, you're able to keep your attention on one object for longer and longer periods of time without getting distracted. And so dharana will mature into dhyana. This is meditation proper. And notice it's the 7th of 8 limbs. It's no joke. People talk about meditation. They take selfies or pictures of themselves and post them on Instagram in a beautiful lotus pose. And they're the envy of their friends. Look at how, she's meditating on the beach. It's amazing. That's not real meditation, actually. It's easy to talk about meditation, almost impossible to do it. Very few people are actually capable of meditation, because real meditation involves absolute one-pointed focus, concentration on one object for a long period of time. And that object is not a worldly one. It's easy to be focused on. If you're greedy, you can focus on, have one-pointed concentration on money, or if you love sense objects, like one-pointed focus on sense objects. That's not. But in spiritual life, you have to have one-pointed focus on God, on the self, on the higher self, the Purusha. Very hard, because the mind is flitting in 100 directions, and the mind gets bored and restless. The ego, it's like, I don't want God. I want X, Y, and Z. Anything but God. Ramakrishna would say, people shed jugfuls of tears for wife, for spouse, for children, because they lost their house, because they lost their car, they this and that. Who weeps for God? Who weeps for God, right? So almost none of us. It's the hardest thing to do is to think of God. So these are high level practices. Meditation in the real sense is a very high level practice. It's an achievement, which requires all of these prerequisites. It's no joke. That doesn't mean you shouldn't meditate. Yeah, start from where you are. But along with that meditation, you need to observe these other things. This is really important. Ethical observances, do's and don'ts, and all these other things, control of the senses, control of the mind. All of that is essential. Otherwise, what's going to happen? You're going to shut your eyes, but you'll still be in the world. Your mind will be on the world. And Gita calls that person a hypocrite, the person who shuts his or her eyes and instead of thinking of God or the self is thinking of worldly things. Then go and enjoy the world if you want to do it, but don't shut your eyes and pretend you're meditating. You can try. It's good as a struggle, as a practice. But don't be a hypocrite. That's the main thing. Especially the danger of Ramakrishna, he would say, when you meditate, dhyan korbe mone bone okore in Bengali. Dhyan korbe, dhyana, same word, dhyan in Bangla. Dhyan korbe in 3 places. Mone, in your own mind, in the seclusion of your own mind, because nobody else will know about it, right? I could be thinking anything you won't know unless you're a mind reader. Mone, bone, in a forest, in a secluded forest. It's uninhabited, so you're doing it alone, in private. Kone, in the corner of a room. So even if you're in a kind of temple or a meditation room where there are a lot of people, some people you'll find will be like meditating in the center of the room, partly, even if it's at a very subtle level, because they want to get other people's attention. And that person wants to impress the other people to show look at how beautiful my lotus pose is. Look at how still I sit. And then that meditation can become a source of ego, which is very dangerous. And so Sri Ramakrishna would always say, when you meditate, do it privately. That's the best way. Then there's no danger of ego creeping in. Okay. Like japa is a great form of meditation. One of the reasons, what is japa? Mental repetition of a mantra. It's because it's mental. You don't say it out loud. You can if you're alone, but in general, it's supposed to be done mentally. The nice thing is, right now, he could be doing japa. Who knows? Maybe he's deep in doing japa. But we wouldn't know because there are no external signs. There's some traditions in which they have this like bag and then they have this Rudraksha beads. They have 108 beads and I use them too, but only in the fixed times of meditation, right? But I could be doing the japa at other times. I even do it when I exercise and stuff like that, right? And when you do that, nobody will know. You're in a car, you're stuck in traffic. Instead of flipping the bird at the other drivers and getting angry and suffering from road rage and this and that, do japa. Listen to spiritual music. You know what I mean? So you can even meditate. It doesn't mean that you have to have your eyes closed. You have to be sitting still. Japa is a form of meditation you could do on the toilet, literally anytime. That's the beauty of it. Okay. And then finally, the culmination of this whole practice should be samadhi, where there are many stages in samadhi. I'm not going into the details, but the final stage is called asampragyata samadhi, where all mental activity ceases. You completely lose external consciousness. And finally, your true nature as the Purusha shines forth because the mind is completely still. The mind is our normal mind is kind of like an agitated body of water. It's only when that body of water becomes still that it can reflect, that it can be a faithful reflection of what? Of the soul. And then finally, if you really enter that highest state of samadhi, what happens? Eventually, you'll leave the physical body in the state of samadhi, but the body turns out to be it's like what Swami Medhananda said when he left his body. Do you know what he said? At the very moment he left his body, he had a brother disciple named Ramakrishnananda who was sitting in Chennai. We have a center in Chennai in South India, Tamil Nadu. And they didn't have phones at the time. This is 1902, July 4th. Swami Vivekananda picked July 4th as the day he would die. So we think that there might be some significance of Independence Day, independence from the body or something. So anyway, right at the moment that he left his body, he mystically communicated with his brother disciple. His name was Shashi. He would call him Shashi, Ramakrishnananda. He would say, and he said, Shashi, I have spat out the body. I have spat out the body. That's the way a realized soul feels, because the body's just like, it's like a pillowcase. Something it's the Gita will use the example in chapter 2 of Vasamsi Jinnani Yataviha. It's like when you're wearing a pair of clothes, a set of clothes during the day. At the end of the day, you remove it because it's worn out, and then you have to put it in laundry, and then you wear a new set of clothes. Just like that, the embodied soul inhabits one physical body and then at the time of death will depart that body and then take up a new body until it attains liberation. Okay. And finally, if you do everything right, you attain what's called kaivalya. Kaivalya literally means isolation or aloneness, and it means basically realizing finally, having direct spiritual knowledge that you are the Purusha separate from nature, separate from the body-mind complex. So that's the purpose of this whole thing. How is this relevant? Well, we can, even if we see, it depends on what even if you're Hindu, Hinduism is a vast religion and there are different traditions within it. One person can be a Vaishnava, another person can be a Shakta, another person can be an Advaita, and another person can be a yogi. That's, but there's so many practical tips here. Like this, especially this Ashtanga yoga is extremely helpful. A lot of the stuff that I was outlining. And we can, even if we don't accept the whole metaphysical dualism and this kind of stuff, because Vedanta is very different in a way, right? There's no dualism at the end of it. It depends on what school of Vedanta you're talking about, but you don't have to accept the whole package. But you can, this is the attitude that I think any real Hindu should have, which is that there's something to learn from every spiritual tradition throughout the world. And whatever is helpful and beneficial, take it and try to incorporate it into your own practice. You don't need to subscribe to the whole package, right? So I'd say the same thing about this. There's so many great gems for spiritual practice and very practical tips that we can incorporate into our own life. So any questions or thoughts or difficulties or problems? It's a lot to absorb. It's true. I barely even scratched the surface, but yeah.
Does the eight state samadhi relate to moksha, like the four pillars that you were talking about earlier? Are they the same?
Right. Great question. So it's only through the attainment of the highest level of samadhi, which is called asamprayagata samadhi, that you realize your true nature as Purusha. And it's only when you realize that you are the Purusha separate from the body-mind complex that you can attain moksha. But the reason, and this is something I was thinking about talking about, but it's already 7:50, so that. But this is an interesting question. Who exactly is bound and liberated in yoga philosophy? This is tricky. And part of the reason is because of their metaphysical dualism, because there's only Purusha and Prakriti. Now, what if the answer is, well, Purusha, the conscious soul? Well, the problem is that Sankhya and Yoga define the Purusha as eternally liberated, Nitya Mukta. So it could never be bound. So that also can't be trapped in the cycle of reincarnation. Then what about the Prakriti side, the nature side? So maybe it's a body-mind complex that's bound and liberated. Great. Only one problem, one hitch. It's insentient. How can a stone be bound or liberated? It's literally the body and the mind are as insentient as this table. What does it mean for a table to be bound or liberated or to strive for liberation? The very idea of striving or being bound implies consciousness. But consciousness in Sankhya and Yoga philosophy falls on the side of Purusha. I talk about this. I have a book that's coming out in a couple of months called Karma and Rebirth in Hinduism. And I talk about how in different Hindu traditions, they have subtly differing answers to the question of what exactly is the reincarnating entity. And Sankhya explicitly says that the reincarnating entity is the subtle body, which falls on the side of insentient nature. It's the insentient subtle body, the linga sharira. But there seems to be a kind of obvious problem with that, which is what I just said, which is like, well, this subtle body is as insentient as a stone. And if it makes no sense for a stone to reincarnate, what sense does it make for a physical body to even if it's a subtly physical body? There needs to be consciousness behind it. The Vedantic answer is a different one. The reincarnating entity is the Jivatma in association with the subtle body. Do you follow that? The Jivatma is the individual, eternal individual soul, an immaterial individual soul. At the time of death, what happens? Let's say I die. My Jivatma, my individual soul, will depart from this physical body. That's why people, when they have near-death experiences, they picture themselves, they see themselves in the corner of the room, like at the ceiling, looking down at their body. That's the Jivatma, in association with the subtle body, which is the mind, basically, which is a subtle form of matter. So it's the eternal soul, which is immaterial and non-physical, in association with the subtly physical body, the subtle body, that reincarnates from life to life, according to Vedanta. The problem in Sankhya and Yoga is that they don't believe in a Jivatma, at least traditional Sankhya yogis. They don't, because where does the Jiva fall in this dualistic framework? The Jivatma doesn't fall inside of Purusha because the Jivatma is supposed to be bound, and the Purusha is never bound. And it never is subject to transmigration, to reincarnation. But the Jivatma can't really fall inside of Prakriti either because it's an immaterial, non-physical entity and it's conscious. Okay, this is a very subtle, but it's a very interesting issue, actually. And I think it's a very serious issue. It's one that he tries to address here and that a lot of commentators and scholars have talked about. But I haven't found any satisfactory answer to the question. Within this philosophy of Sankhya and Yoga, you're talking a lot, you have to engage in all this stuff in order to finally attain liberation. Who is the person? Who is that conscious entity that is striving for liberation? It gets really tricky. Interestingly, there's one modern day yogi named Hariharananda Aranya. Hariharananda Aranya. He was a great Sankhya yogi monk who lived in the early 20th century. I visited his ashrama several times in Madhupur, Jharkhand, in India. He says he actually uses the concept of jiva, which you normally only find in Vedanta, but he brings it into Sankhya Yoga. And he says basically, who is the reincarnating entity? Who is bound? Who is liberated? The jiva. And then he basically moves in the direction of saying, but then what is the jiva? Ultimately, it turns out not to exist. And so liberation consists, it's a kind of like this, it's a kind of phantom entity born of the union of Purusha and Prakriti. And because Purusha and Prakriti are never actually conjoined in any way, that's why it's a phantom entity. It gets very tricky, but the idea is he's saying that it's not even true that we are reincarnating. So it kind of moves in a more Advaita Vedanta kind of direction. We think we're bound, and that's why we think we suffer. In reality, we've just been the Purusha all along. It gets very heady. I don't want your heads to spin, but I'm just telling you, I'm pointing out that this is like a live issue and a big issue of philosophical debate in scholarship on Sankhya and Yoga philosophy. Who exactly is bound and liberated? Who or what reincarnates? What is a reincarnating entity? There's no easy answer to the question, in my opinion. Okay, and Vedanta arguably is in a better position because it has a different answer to the question, because it doesn't subscribe to this metaphysical dualism. And it believes in the idea of a Jiva Atma, an eternal individual soul, which takes up different bodies, which is bound, which gradually attains liberation. Okay, any other questions? No? You're all speechless. It's fine. It's a lot to absorb, admittedly. Yeah? All right, good. Thank you, everyone. Om Shanti 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 Hari Om Tat Sat.